Have you ever picked up your phone and with one simple message, felt your entire life tilt sideways? That's how my story begins. Not with a thunderclap, but with the hush of an ordinary morning and an email that quietly rewrote everything I thought I knew. My name is Emily Hargrove, and for as long as I can remember, I lived and breathed the legacy of my family's business. But legacies aren't always a gift. Sometimes they're a weight you don't realize you're carrying until someone tells you to put it down. Growing up in Portland, Oregon, our family name was painted in bold blue letters on every truck and sign in the city's industrial district. I spent more holidays on the factory floor than at home, learning the sound of machines before I learned to drive. My father, Robert, was the kind of man who built things with his hands and measured success by the hours he never took off. My mother, Linda, managed the books and the birthdays with the same careful attention. And then there was me, the middle child, the peacekeeper, the one everyone relied on to fix things, but rarely asked how I was doing. For years I convinced myself that belonging meant blending in, that love meant loyalty, and that someday all the late nights and skipped vacations would be enough. I never questioned the extra shifts or the weekends spent chasing down missing invoices. If anything, I wore my exhaustion like a badge of honor, certain that my silent sacrifices were the thread holding us together. I believed that if I just worked a little harder, stayed a little quieter, my family would finally see me, not just as an employee, but as a daughter and an equal. But life has a way of handing you the truth in the smallest of packages. The morning it all changed, the world outside was still waking up, rain tapping gently against the kitchen window. My phone buzzed with a new message. No subject, no greeting. Just a few clipped sentences from my father informing me that due to restructuring, my services would no longer be required at Hargrove Industrial Solutions. No meeting, no thank you, not even my name. I read it 3 times before I let myself feel anything at all. If you've ever poured your heart into something, a job, a relationship, a dream, only to have it quietly taken from you, then maybe you'll understand what happened next. For a moment, I sat frozen in the blue light of my kitchen mug, in hand, coffee growing cold, trying to convince myself that this was just a bad dream. I waited for the follow-up call, the explanation, the last-minute rescue that never came. All I found was the echo of my own breathing and the sudden suffocating quiet of a life built around someone else's approval. But endings aren't always what they seem. Sometimes the day you lose everything you thought mattered is the day you begin to find yourself. I started this journey believing that strength was about endurance and sacrifice. What I learned is that true strength is sometimes the courage to walk away without rage, without begging, and without looking back. In the next hour, I want to share that journey with you. Not just the pain and betrayal, but the moments of quiet triumph that came after. You'll hear how I pieced together the story behind my own erasure, the choices that led my family to shut me out, and the path I took to reclaim my sense of worth. Along the way, I'll show you the real costs of silent sacrifice and the lessons I learned about standing up for yourself, even when it means leaving everything familiar behind. So if you've ever wondered what happens after the door closes, if you've ever felt invisible, undervalued, or quietly written out of the frame, this story is for you. Because sometimes the only way to be seen is to stop waiting for someone else's permission and choose your own beginning. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that what's waiting on the other side of goodbye is more powerful than you ever imagined. Let's begin. Some stories start with fireworks or endings you can see coming a mile away. Mine began on an ordinary Wednesday, as forgettable as any other. The world outside my kitchen window was soft with morning fog, the kind of hush that makes you think anything is possible if you just start early enough. I'd set my phone on the table beside my mug of coffee, a habit formed from years of being on call for the family business, ready to field questions about shipping suppliers or payroll at a moment's notice. Even on quiet days, I was never really off duty. That morning, I wasn't expecting anything more than the usual cascade of emails. But when the message arrived, something in me shifted like the wind changing directions without warning. The email itself was almost laughably brief. No greeting, no sign-off, no warmth or warning. Just a string of formal words from my father's company account. Due to a strategic restructuring, your position at Hargrove Industrial Solutions will be terminated effective immediately. Further instructions will be sent by HR. There was no "Emily, no thank you for your years of service," not even a line to acknowledge the 17 years I'd given to the family name. I stared at the screen, willing another message to appear, a follow-up, an explanation, anything that would give this ending a human shape. But nothing came. Just the blinking cursor and the realization that I was in a single breath invisible. For a long time, I just sat there. I'd read stories of people getting fired by email, seen social media debates on corporate coldness, but never imagined that kind of thing could happen in my own family. I thought about all those late nights spent crunching numbers, the weekends given up for urgent shipments, the birthdays celebrated in a break room instead of at home. My name was on the invoices, on the crisis reports, even on the company holiday cards. But when it came time to let me go, my name wasn't even worth typing. It's funny, the things you notice in moments of loss. For me, it was the absence of a name, of gratitude, of any sign that what I'd built had mattered. That sense of erasure hit deeper than any argument or confrontation could have. It wasn't just the job I was losing, it was the identity I'd wrapped around myself for almost 2 decades. When you work for your family, every decision feels personal, even the ones dressed up in business language. There's an expectation, maybe especially in American families, that loyalty will be met with loyalty, that hard work will buy you a seat at the table. I'd believed that myth for so long, I didn't even recognize it as a myth until it disappeared. In that quiet kitchen, I had to confront a truth I'd ignored for years. Sometimes your place in the family isn't as secure as you think. Of course, it would be easier to say I was angry, to describe some righteous fury at the injustice of it all. But what I felt more than anything was confusion, a blank space where certainty used to be. I tried to think of a time when I'd done something to deserve this, replayed old conversations in my mind, looking for a hint I might have missed. Had I argued too much in the last board meeting, been too cautious about the risky expansion? Or maybe I thought, with a quiet ache, I'd simply made myself too useful, too steady, the kind of person people forget until they need you, and forget again the moment you're gone. It's a peculiar pain being left out, not because you failed, but because you were never really seen. That's something I want you to hear, especially if you've ever felt overlooked by the people you care about most. Sometimes the hardest part isn't the ending itself, but realizing you never truly belonged in the way you hoped. I remembered a colleague from years ago, Sarah, a brilliant operations manager at a local tech firm, who once told me, if your worth is measured by your output, someday you'll be replaced by someone faster, cheaper, or easier to ignore. I'd nodded along, then sure, that family was different. But as I sat with that cold email, I understood what she meant down to my bones. What do you do when the story you've been telling yourself no longer matches your reality? That was the question swirling in my mind as the sun crept higher, dissolving the fog outside. I wanted to call someone, my mother, my younger brother, even an old friend from college, but the words felt too heavy, the shame too fresh. I opened my laptop, scrolled through old photos from company retreats, holiday parties, even the grainy cell phone snap of the day we celebrated breaking, even after a rough year. Every image was another reminder of the life I thought I had. But the silence from my family was louder than any memory. There's a peculiar sort of clarity that comes with loss. When something so central to your identity is taken away, it strips everything else down to its essentials. I realized sitting there in my kitchen that I could either let that email define me, or I could begin to define myself outside of it. That choice wasn't easy, and it didn't come with a roadmap. But it was the first lesson loss gave me. When someone else tries to write you out of the story, you can either disappear or start your own new chapter. If you're watching this and thinking, I'd never let that happen to me, I get it. We all like to believe we'd fight back, that we'd storm the office or demand a reckoning. But sometimes endings don't come with a bang. They come quietly, in the language of business, in the silence between people who once cared. What matters isn't how loudly you're pushed out, but how bravely you choose to move forward. For me, that journey started not with a confrontation, but with a decision to stop waiting for someone else to tell me I mattered. And so, as I sat in that kitchen phone, quiet and inbox empty, I promised myself I would not chase an explanation or beg for closure. Instead, I would gather my story piece by piece and discover who I could become when my name was no longer on the door. That was the first step. In the next part, I'll share how carrying the weight of a family legacy can shape you, and how sometimes letting go is the only way to find yourself again. There's a funny thing about growing up in a family business. The boundaries between work and home never really exist. For as long as I can remember, the story of Hargrove Industrial Solutions ran parallel to the story of my own life, so tightly interwoven that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. I was the kind of kid who colored in the margins of meeting agendas during summer breaks, who learned the difference between net and gross profit, before I understood the rules of baseball. To me, family time was measured not in holidays or road trips, but in late-night pizza on the warehouse floor, surrounded by the clatter of machines and the hum of my parents' voices strategizing about the next quarter. From the outside, our company looked like a model of American family success. A father at the helm, a mother keeping the books, children brought up in the tradition of hard work and loyalty. People admired our unity, our so-called old-fashioned values. But beneath the surface, there was a different kind of reality, one that most outsiders never saw. I started working part-time the summer I turned 16. Answering phones and filing invoices, slowly moving up through every unglamorous job no one else wanted. My father called it learning the ropes. My mother called it paying your dues. I didn't complain. I was proud to be needed, proud to belong, even if it meant being the one who stayed late to double-check the numbers when everyone else went home. Looking back, I can see how easy it was to lose myself in all of it. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from always doing the work behind the scenes. I was the fixer, the peacemaker, the one who soothed egos after boardroom fights and filled the gaps when someone else dropped the ball. I learned to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to keep my worries to myself for the sake of the family. I became fluent in the unspoken language of obligation, the quiet agreements that kept the business running but often left me feeling isolated. If a client threatened to walk away, I'd write the apology email. If the payroll system crashed at midnight, it was me on the phone to tech support, talking someone through a solution as the sun rose over Portland's river. I know I'm not alone in this. I've met plenty of people at industry conferences and late-night online forums, even in line at the grocery store, who tell similar stories. There's the daughter who took over her father's hardware store after he got sick, only to realize no one wanted to listen to her ideas. There's the son who skipped college to help with the family diner, promising himself he'd leave just as soon as things stabilized, only to find a decade had slipped by while he was scraping plates and swallowing resentment. We're everywhere the ones who stay, because someone has to, because we hope our loyalty will someday be rewarded with recognition or at the very least a sense of belonging. But the truth is, work done in the shadows rarely earns a spotlight. The big deals, the new contracts, the flashy expansions, those belong to my younger brother Jake, who had the confidence of someone who'd never been told not yet or you're too young. Jake was brilliant, no doubt, and the kind of leader people naturally followed. But while he was presenting at trade shows and making speeches to investors, I was the one who made sure the numbers added up, that vendors got paid on time, that the whole engine of the company didn't grind to a halt. I don't say this to diminish his role. I just wish looking back that I'd understood mine wasn't any less important. There's a memory that stands out to me now sharper than most. It was a year when cash flow was tight, and a storm had flooded our main warehouse. Insurance claims dragged on, and our team was facing layoffs right before the holidays. My father was too proud to borrow from the bank, and my mother was quietly panicking over the ledgers. Without telling anyone, I dipped into my own savings to cover 2 weeks' payroll. I created a shell account, made it look like an anonymous loan, and watched the relief wash over my parents when checks cleared and the crisis passed. No one asked where the money came from. No one needed to know, I told myself. But when my father thanked Jake at the next staff meeting for pulling the family through, I smiled and clapped along. It was easier that way. The lesson here isn't about self-sacrifice, though. It's about the danger of measuring your worth by what you do for others, especially when those others are the people you love most. I believed for years that loyalty meant silence, and that true belonging was something you earned by giving more than you got. But that kind of thinking is a slow erosion one that wears you down until you're little more than a shadow of yourself. If you see yourself in my story, know this: being essential to a machine is not the same as being valued as a person. What I wish someone had told me then is that real sustaining love, isn't transactional. It doesn't keep score. The more you shrink yourself to fit someone else's vision of family, the more you risk disappearing from your own life. It took losing everything for me to see that, but I hope you don't have to wait that long. Sometimes honoring your own boundaries is the bravest thing you can do, even when it feels selfish. As I sat with the memory of those years, the pride and exhaustion, the invisible victories, and silent disappointments, I began to realize that I'd been carrying a weight that wasn't really mine to bear. The legacy I thought I was protecting had, in its own way, been holding me back. In the next part, I'll show you what happens when the lines between love and duty blur, and how the slow process of being erased can sneak up on you one small cut at a time. Some losses happen all at once: a single conversation, a closed door, a final email. But more often it's the little things that slip away first. For me, the slow process of being erased from Hargrove Industrial Solutions started with changes so subtle I almost didn't notice. The first was an updated org chart sent out one Monday morning. My title, Director of Operations, was no longer there. Instead, there was a new position, Chief Strategy Officer, a role my brother Jake now held. I asked my mother if it was a mistake. She smiled and said, "We're just streamlining, honey. You're still essential." I nodded, but the truth is, it felt like a window had closed behind me, and I hadn't even seen the breeze leave the room. Over the next few months, little permissions started to disappear. The shared drive where I kept vendor schedules and payroll records suddenly showed access denied. I asked IT, and they told me my account had been moved to a more limited group. At meetings, the talking points I used to prepare quietly landed in Jake's hands, and when I spoke up, people nodded politely but didn't really listen. At first, I told myself it was just a phase. Companies grow roles. Change, nothing personal. But as weeks turned into months, my responsibilities shrank. Projects I'd launched were handed off to others without explanation. I found myself CC'd instead of addressed directly. It was like being on the wrong side of a soundproof wall, seeing mouths move, but never hearing my own name. If you've ever been quietly left out, not for what you did wrong, but because someone decided you were no longer central, you know this ache. It's a death by 1,000 paper cuts. And every small omission stings just a little more. I remember updating the budget forecast one evening, only to discover I no longer had editing rights. The spreadsheet I'd built from scratch, colored and coded year after year, was suddenly out of reach. I sent a quick message to Jake. "Hey, can you let me back in?" He replied. "Oh, sorry, Em. We've consolidated that process under the strategy team. Thanks for all you did to set it up, though." I sat with that "thank you" for a long time. It was the kind you give to someone leaving a party early, not to someone who helped throw the party in the first place. There's an odd kind of dignity you try to preserve when you realize you're being phased out. I found myself working harder, showing up early, volunteering for new tasks, over-preparing for meetings, hoping someone would notice my effort and pull me back into the fold. But the more I tried, the more invisible I became. Colleagues stopped coming to me with questions. My name was missing from the company newsletter, and eventually even my photo disappeared from the website's leadership page. At family dinners, business talk shifted to whispers I wasn't meant to overhear. I'd catch the end of a sentence she doesn't need to know and swallow my hurt with my mashed potatoes. It's easy to blame yourself in moments like this. I replayed every decision, every disagreement, every time I'd pushed for a safer path instead of a flashier one. Was I too cautious, too stubborn? Did I become boring or outdated? I remembered a friend, Marcus, who'd worked at a major tech company in Seattle. He once told me about the meeting after the meeting, the quiet shifting of alliances and priorities that made some people disappear without a trace. "You'll never see it coming," he'd warned, because no one ever says it out loud. I didn't believe him then. I do now. If there's a lesson to be found in this slow erasure, it's that silence is rarely neutral. We like to imagine that if no one's criticizing us, things must be fine. But in reality, silence can be just as loud as a shout. It's the quiet choices, the emails not sent, the invitations not extended, the keys quietly taken away that add up to an answer you can't ignore. The mistake I made was confusing absence of conflict with acceptance. I waited for someone to fight with me to at least tell me why I didn't belong anymore. Instead, they just moved on. And so did I, at least in the ways that mattered to them. One day, a new office plan was circulated. My desk was now in the far corner near the copier, away from the windows and the boardroom. I boxed up my plants and photos, feeling both ridiculous and strangely relieved. That's when I realized sometimes the worst part isn't being pushed out, but being made optional, left until last, and then quietly written out of the story you helped build. I drove home in the early dusk, the city lights flickering on, and wondered how many people out there were sitting at their kitchen tables feeling the same sting of being left behind. But even as I grieved those small losses, something else started to grow in their place. A sense of clarity, maybe, or the beginnings of anger that wasn't loud, but steady. I started to ask myself questions I'd never dared before. What did I actually want? Was I staying out of loyalty, or out of fear of what life would look like on the outside? Could I survive, maybe even thrive, without their approval? It was scary, but also oddly freeing. Sometimes you only find out what you're capable of when someone else stops making room for you. In the next part, I'll share how family ties can be both your safety net and your cage, and what happens when you realize that blood isn't always thicker than the silent contracts of power and pride. Sometimes being erased is the first step toward being seen by yourself for the very first time. People like to say that family is forever, that no matter what happens in the world, you can always count on the people who share your name. For a long time, I believed that, especially in a family business, where boardroom conversations ended at the dinner table and the boundary between employee and relative blurred with every bite. My father, Robert, was not just my boss, but the person whose approval I craved most. A man who saw the world in black and white, winners and losers, strong and weak. My mother, Linda, was both the peacemaker and the keeper of secrets, always quick to smooth things over and just as quick to remind me that this is how family works. And then there was Jake, my brother, who never seemed to doubt his place in either the company or our family. But what I learned slowly and painfully is that family can also be a trap, especially when business is involved. I remember a Thanksgiving when the usual jokes about shop talk around the table turned sharp. Jake dominated the conversation, eager to unveil his bold new strategy for the coming year, while I quietly corrected numbers on my phone beneath the tablecloth. Dad beamed with pride at Jake's vision and barely nodded at my offer to review the cost projections. After dinner, as dishes clattered and laughter faded, Mom leaned over and whispered, "Don't take it personally, Em. Your brother just needs to feel important right now." I wanted to protest, to say that my work mattered too, but the words died in my throat. Family, it seemed, was also about knowing your place and staying in it. The deeper I got into the family business, the more I realized that loyalty was a double-edged sword. There were perks, yes, inside jokes, history, and unspoken trust that you could weather hard times together. But there was also a silent contract, an understanding that some voices mattered more than others. When I pushed back against risky investments or suggested we slow down during a volatile year, my concerns were met with polite dismissal. "Let's not make this a big deal," Dad would say, looking past me to Jake, who'd already moved on to the next slide in his presentation. It didn't matter how many hours I'd spent running the numbers or how many times my cautious approach had saved us from trouble. In our family, being right wasn't as important as being loud. I've since learned that my story isn't unique. There's an entire generation of Americans caught between loyalty to family and the hard truth that not every family rewards that loyalty. I once sat in a workshop for women in family enterprises and heard stories that mirrored my own daughters, sidelined for sons, siblings pitted against each other, decades of dedication erased by a single board vote. One woman, whose family owned a chain of grocery stores, shared how her uncle had quietly rewritten the bylaws to strip her of voting power after her father passed away. "Blood is thicker than water," she told me, "but not thicker than an unsigned contract." Her words stayed with me, a cold comfort in the months that followed. The lesson here is simple, but hard-won. Love and business do not always play by the same rules. Family can offer a sense of belonging, but it can also ask you to trade your voice for your seat at the table. The more I tried to prove my worth through hard work and patience, the more invisible I became, not just as an employee, but as a daughter. I realized painfully that love offered as leverage isn't really love at all. It's just another form of control. Looking back, I wish I'd trusted my instincts sooner. I wish I'd recognized that being asked to shrink myself wasn't a sign of family harmony, but of an imbalance of power. If you're in a similar situation, I hope you'll remember you can respect your family and still protect your own boundaries. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to play by rules that weren't made for you. In the next part, I'll share the hidden sacrifices, the ones nobody saw, the ones that kept the lights on and the payroll running even as recognition slipped further away. Because behind every family business success story, there are unsung heroes, holding things together in the shadows, often at great personal cost. People often talk about sacrifice as if it's something noble, a grand gesture everyone will notice and remember. But the sacrifices that truly shape us are rarely so dramatic. More often, they're the quiet decisions we make in the margins, working late, when no one is watching, giving up vacations, or saying yes to another emergency, so someone else can breathe easier. My years at Hargrove Industrial Solutions were built on these invisible acts. I can still recall the winter our biggest client nearly went bankrupt, and the company payroll hung by a thread. Dad refused to take out a loan, worried it would make us look weak to the board. So without telling anyone, I used my own savings, the nest egg I'd set aside for a down payment on a home, and wired the funds through a holding account to make sure everyone's checks cleared on time. I didn't expect thanks, and I certainly didn't get any. The next week, Dad praised Jake at the all-hands meeting for navigating our toughest financial storm yet. I watched Jake accept the applause, a little confused but happy to play the hero. It would have been easy to let bitterness take root right then, but I told myself the company's survival was reward enough. And that's the trouble with silent sacrifice. It can become a habit, one that's hard to break, even when the cost is personal. Over time, I noticed the small things. I was letting go a weekend, with friends, the promise of a real vacation, the hobby I once loved, that gathered dust in the garage. The hardest part wasn't the work itself, but the growing sense that no one saw how much I gave. There was the Christmas I spent on the phone with a supplier in Malaysia, negotiating a rush shipment while my family unwrapped gifts in the next room. There was the string of birthdays celebrated by text message, because just one more thing always came up at the office. Every time I put the business first, I told myself it was only temporary. Things will settle down, I thought, and then I'll make time for myself. But there's always another crisis in a family business, another reason to wait, another fire to put out. A friend once shared her own story of working behind the scenes at her parents' bakery, baking through the night and running deliveries at dawn. She confessed that she didn't mind the hard work, but what wore her down was knowing her contributions would never be mentioned, let alone celebrated at the family table. Her father believed that love meant sacrifice, but he'd never learned how to say thank you. Her story echoed in my own life, reminding me how easy it is to confuse being needed with being valued. The lesson I finally learned is this: sacrifice, while meaningful, should not come at the expense of your own well-being. We are taught, especially in families like mine, that giving until it hurts is a virtue. But all too often it's an excuse others use to avoid uncomfortable conversations about fairness, gratitude, or real support. There's no shame in stepping back and asking, what do I need, or in setting boundaries that protect your own heart. I wish I'd realized sooner that love is not measured by how much you can endure, but by how honestly you can show up for yourself. By the time I looked up, years had passed in a blur of unremarked victories and invisible losses. The business was stronger, but I was tired, bone tired in a way that no amount of sleep could fix. It dawned on me that waiting for recognition or for someone else to say, "You've done enough," was a losing game. No one else could give me the validation I'd been craving. I had to find it within myself. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment when the final blow fell, a betrayal I never saw coming, and what it taught me about trusting myself even when the people I loved most turned away. Sometimes the only way to find your strength is to face the heartbreak you've spent years trying to avoid. There are moments that divide a life into before and after. For me, the sharpest of these came on a rainy Thursday evening, just as I was shutting down my laptop. An email popped up, subject line, board resolution. I recognized the address immediately, my mother's, Linda's, personal account. My heart skipped. I opened it expecting maybe a quick question about payroll or a gentle reminder to get some rest. But what I found instead was a formal document, cold and impersonal, signed with her looping familiar signature. The resolution outlined my transition out of Hargrove Industrial Solutions. At the bottom, just below the line where her name appeared, was the final blow. Effective immediately, all responsibilities and decision-making authority are transferred to the Chief Strategy Officer. That, of course, was Jake. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My mind replayed every conversation I'd had with my mother over the years, every midnight phone call, every worried glance across the dinner table. She'd always been my safe place, the one who told me to hang in there, the one who tucked handwritten notes into my desk drawer when times were hard. Yet here it was, in black and white, her decision to let me go. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a technicality, or at the very least something forced by my father or the board. But as I read the resolution again, I could hear her voice and every carefully chosen word. A few days later, unable to hold in my hurt, I called my mother asking for an explanation. She sounded tired, her voice softer than usual. "It wasn't personal, Em," she told me, almost whispering. "The business is changing. Your brother has the vision we need right now. I hope someday you'll understand." I pressed her, reminding her of all the times I'd been the one to keep the doors open to comfort her when Dad's temper flared, to keep the team together when morale hit rock bottom. She was quiet for a long moment, then simply said, "Sometimes love means letting go." I hung up more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. The hardest part about betrayal is not just losing a job, or even the recognition for all you've done. It's the shattering of trust, the knowledge that someone who knew your struggles and sacrifices still chose not to stand beside you when it mattered most. I thought about friends who'd survived similar heartbreak, like Allison, who was voted out of her father's architecture firm by her own siblings, or Marco, whose uncle had rewritten the company bylaws without ever mentioning it at Sunday dinner. In each story, the deepest wound was not financial but personal. The pain of realizing family can put business first, no matter what's at stake. If there's a lesson I've taken from this, it's the danger of placing your self-worth in someone else's hands, even someone you love. For too long, I'd believed my loyalty and hard work would eventually earn me a place I could never lose. But families, like companies, are made of people with their own fears, ambitions, and blind spots. I learned painfully that no one, not even your mother, can guarantee your place when priorities shift and power is on the line. In the days that followed, I wandered through my routines in a fog, unsure of who I was without the job I'd built my life around. But somewhere beneath the hurt, a quiet resolve began to grow. If my family could let me go, maybe it was time for me to let go too, not just of the company, but of the hope that things would ever go back to the way they were. The freedom was bittersweet, but it was real. In the next part, I'll share how, even in the wake of loss, there is power in reclaiming your story, starting with the small, steady steps of protecting what you've earned and learning to trust yourself again, no matter who tries to write you out of the narrative. Grief doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it arrives as a long, steady drizzle, soaking into every part of your life before you even realize you're wet. In the days after my mother's email, I drifted through routines in a kind of haze. The ache was raw, but beneath it all, a stubborn part of me kept moving. If my family had decided I no longer belonged, at least I could choose how my story ended. I turned my focus away from the boardroom and back to myself and to something I'd almost forgotten: the quiet power of documentation. In every family business, there are invisible threads, years of spreadsheets, contracts, emails, and late-night bank transfers, all quietly weaving together the real story behind closed doors. I'd kept careful records all those years, not out of suspicion, but habit. Invoices I'd paid from my personal accounts, the time I'd covered payroll during the flood, the hours of overtime I'd never claimed. Each folder, each file was proof that I hadn't just been a passenger on this ship. I'd helped build and steer it, even when no one else was watching. With help from a friend who worked in corporate law, I started to gather everything: digital records, backup drives, color-coded spreadsheets. I printed out emails where I'd made recommendations, flagged financial discrepancies, and documented the times I'd personally saved the company from crisis. At first, it felt almost petty, like I was building a case against people I still loved. But as the stack of documents grew, so did my sense of agency. I wasn't plotting revenge. I was simply claiming the narrative I'd quietly shaped for years. One evening, as I sat surrounded by paperwork, I remembered a story from a local news segment: a woman in Spokane who'd been squeezed out of her family's bakery after decades of work. She'd lost her job and nearly her retirement. but her meticulous records allowed her to negotiate a fair settlement and start a new life. Her quiet diligence wasn't dramatic, but it was her shield, and in the end, her freedom. Her experience became my guide proof that even those who are written out can still write the ending. The lesson here is both practical and deeply personal. When you feel powerless when others control the story, documentation is your lifeline. It's not just about legal protection, it's about remembering that your efforts and sacrifices are real, even if no one ever thanked you for them. For me, every spreadsheet was a small act of self-respect. A reminder that I mattered, that I'd built something no board vote could erase. I wish someone had told me years ago, keep your receipts not out of mistrust, but out of respect for your own work. By the time I handed my files to my lawyer, I felt something shift. The sadness was still there, but it was joined by a quiet pride, a knowledge that I could shape my own next step, even as doors closed behind me. I wasn't powerless. I had a stake in this legacy and a say in how it moved forward, even if it was only by protecting what I'd rightfully earned. In the next part, I'll share how letting go took on new meaning, how negotiating my exit and selling my shares became not just a legal transaction, but an act of hope for the life I wanted beyond the family business. Because sometimes, the way to reclaim your future is not by fighting for the same old seat, but by building a new table altogether. Letting go sounds like a simple act, but the truth is it can feel more like tearing down a house you once dreamed of growing old in. When I realized I still held a sizable stake in Hargrove Industrial Solutions, I knew that staying tied to the business, no matter how passively, would only keep old wounds open. With all my records in place, I met with my lawyer and quietly started the process of selling my shares. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final plea from my family. In the world of business, paperwork and signatures often speak louder than any argument ever could. The negotiations themselves were surprisingly calm. I expected anger or resistance from the board, but the operating agreement was on my side. There was no clause to prevent me from selling my stake to an outside investor. It was a relief to be treated with respect, not because of my last name, but because of my thorough preparation and documented value. As the sale moved forward, I felt both anxiety and a strange peace. I was no longer waiting for permission or forgiveness. For the first time, I was the one setting the terms. As the ink dried on the final agreement, a wave of relief washed over me. But it didn't take long for ripples to spread. Within weeks, the new stakeholder began a full audit of the company. Old gaps in the books were uncovered, and questionable transactions, those I'd warned about for years, were finally exposed. My phone buzzed constantly, messages from my brother, desperate voicemails from Dad, even a few panicked emails from longtime employees. "Can you help fix this?" they asked. "You know how the numbers work. You always did." Each time I felt a deep ache for the role I'd played and the people I'd cared about. But I reminded myself I had chosen this exit. My days of being the family fixer were done. It was painful to watch the family business struggle, but there was a strange clarity in knowing the truth had finally come to light. I thought of other stories I'd read, like the Minnesota farmer who'd quietly sold his share of a struggling co-op, then watched from a distance as old secrets unraveled. He described it as mourning a house fire that finally cleared the ground for something new. That image stuck with me. Sometimes letting go isn't about escape. It's about allowing what's broken to finally be seen for what it is, so real healing can start. The lesson for me was that closure doesn't always come wrapped in a happy ending or a reconciled relationship. Sometimes it's simply the ability to walk away with dignity, knowing you did your part and stood by your values. It takes courage to let go, especially when everyone expects you to stay and fix things. But every ending, even a painful one, is also a beginning. I found peace not in saving the business, but in saving myself from resentment, from old patterns, and from the illusion that I alone could hold everything together. In the next part, I'll share what happened when the dust settled, the fallout, the awkward silences, and how the world keeps turning even after your old life goes up in smoke. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that true freedom sometimes means choosing yourself, even when it feels like you're walking away from everything you've ever known. The days after the sale felt strangely quiet, like the world was holding its breath. For the first time in years, I woke up without the familiar pressure of unfinished business waiting for me. But the silence didn't last long. News of the company's audit spread quickly through our community and within my own family. My brother Jake called first, his voice a mix of panic and disbelief. "Emily, you have to help us," he pleaded. "They're digging through everything, you know those old numbers better than anyone." There was a time when I would have dropped everything to rescue him. But now I listened calm and clear and simply said, "You'll figure it out. I have faith in you." The line was silent for a moment before he hung up. Next, it was Dad. He left a string of short, urgent voicemails, most of them half-finished thoughts and apologies never quite spoken aloud. I recognized the old pattern when things went wrong. I'd always been the one to patch things up to make hard choices easier for everyone else. But this time, I let the calls go to voicemail. Not out of spite, but out of a new respect for my own boundaries. The company had to reckon with its choices, now just as I had reckoned with mine. My mother, always more careful, sent an email. "Can we meet privately? No lawyers." I read it, saved it, and never replied. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said by the silence between us. What surprised me most about the fallout wasn't the chaos in the company or the desperate pleas from my family. It was how quickly the rest of life kept moving. Friends checked in with kind messages, and acquaintances sent articles about family business breakups and new beginnings. I discovered how many others had survived similar reckonings. A client who'd left her father's restaurant. A neighbor who'd walked away from a generational farm. Their stories echoed mine: pain, regret, and finally a kind of peace. It was comforting to know I wasn't alone and that even the messiest endings could be survived. In one particularly honest conversation, a former colleague told me, "It's strange, isn't it, how we're taught to believe family is everything, until one day you realize you're just one more character in someone else's story." She was right. For so long, I'd made myself indispensable, certain that was the only way to be loved or respected. But real belonging, I learned, isn't earned by solving every problem or carrying every burden. Sometimes it comes from letting go and allowing others to face the consequences of their own choices. That's the lesson I hope stays with you. Boundaries aren't about shutting people out. They're about protecting the person you're becoming. The temptation to step back into old roles, peacemaker, fixer, silent partner, was strong, especially as the business faltered. But every time I chose silence over rescue, I felt lighter, more myself. I discovered the simple joy of mornings without crisis calls, evenings spent with friends who valued me for my presence, not my problem solving. The company survived its reckoning, and so did I. As the dust settled, I realized that letting go of the family business hadn't made my world smaller, it had made it infinitely larger. I could see possibilities I'd never allowed myself to imagine. In the next part, I'll share how I began rebuilding my life on my own terms, crafting a new identity outside the shadow of the family name, and finding hope and meaning where I least expected it. Because sometimes, when you let go of what no longer serves you, you make space for everything you truly need. Starting over is never as dramatic as the movies make it seem. For me, it was a gentle unfolding. A quiet string of days where, for the first time, I chose how to spend my hours. At first, there was uncertainty. Who was I if not the steady hand in the family business? I wandered through farmers' markets and bookstores, took long walks by the river, and allowed myself to be curious about the world outside the routines I'd carried for so long. The sense of possibility was both exhilarating and intimidating, like waking up in a new city without a map. Rebuilding didn't mean erasing my past. It meant acknowledging everything I had given and lost, while choosing not to let it define my future. I began reaching out to old friends, reconnecting with people whose calls I'd missed during the busy years. Some of those relationships blossomed, filling my days with laughter and warmth I hadn't realized I was missing. I took a course in nonprofit management, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. The classroom was full of others starting over, retirees, young parents, even a former lawyer from my own neighborhood. Each person carried their own story of reinvention, and being part of that community reminded me that I wasn't alone. There were days when regret crept in as memories from the company flickered through my mind. I remembered the sound of Dad's voice in the factory, the way Mom would hum while balancing the books, the hopeful look Jake used to have when pitching a new idea. But each time nostalgia threatened to pull me back, I grounded myself in the present. I cooked new recipes, volunteered at the local food bank, and started journaling, writing down not just what I'd lost, but also what I was learning along the way. The act of documenting my growth became its own form of healing. One of the greatest surprises of this new chapter was discovering how much more there was to me than any title or family connection. A former client reached out and asked if I'd consider consulting for a small business navigating its own generational handoff. At first I hesitated, worried the old wounds might reopen. But stepping into that role, I realized I could help others avoid the pain I'd endured, and I could do it on my own terms. My experience wasn't a weight. It was a gift I could share, and it allowed me to set healthy boundaries and foster honest conversations about fairness and respect. The lesson I carry with me is simple but powerful. Sometimes you have to lose the life you planned in order to find the life you're meant to live. Letting go of the Hargrove legacy didn't mean abandoning my roots. It meant choosing to grow in new directions. I learned that worth isn't measured by sacrifice or the approval of others, but by the quiet daily commitment to show up as yourself, flawed, hopeful, and open to what comes next. If you find yourself at a crossroads, maybe mourning what's ended or scared to begin again, know that your story isn't over. Sometimes the best thing you can do is step bravely into the unknown and trust that the pieces will fall into place. Life is larger than any one chapter, and the ending you fear might just be the beginning you need. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope my story reminds you that even after loss, there is joy to be found in new beginnings, and that choosing yourself is always an act of hope. If my story resonated with you even just a little, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Maybe you've faced a similar crossroads, or maybe you're still carrying a weight that isn't really yours. Share your story, your lesson, or just a word that gives you hope. Your voice might be the encouragement someone else needs today. And if you found value in this journey, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, or sharing it with a friend who could use a reminder that new beginnings are always possible. There are more stories to tell, more lessons to discover, and I'd be honored to have you along for the ride. Remember, you are more than any title or old story. The next chapter is yours to write, so make it a good one.